Dick Durbin.
Right. He was the first to call for a ceasefire.
He was the first to call for a ceasefire. Now, Dick Durbin is not doing that without permission from Joe Biden. And Dick Durbin was also, I'm sure you mentioned, was also the first person ever to be recruited by AIPAC.
Wow.
To run in the Senate. And now that was 40 some odd years ago, I think it was.
Man, I was going to say, how old is Dick Durbin?
79.
Old enough to be the number 2 Democrat in the Senate in terms of seniority and in leadership structure, which makes his call for a ceasefire even more impactful than most people saying so.
Well, what it really does in my mind is it I guess it was back in the 70s and 80s. It was in 1982 as a House candidate. Durbin was endorsed by AIPAC. What it indicates to me is that this is where the White House wants to go in some fashion, because there's just Dick Durbin would not be out there saying this when the White House is not saying this, if this wasn't a way in which they go. This is very much like when Sean Fain invites Joe Biden to come to the picket lines, that invitation is probably the idea of the White House.
Right. They've had conversations before.
And so Dick Durbin does this in the morning, and then by later in the afternoon, you have Chris Murphy, who is considered sort of like the one of the more prominent voices in the Democratic Party in foreign relations, as it were. And here is, and note, the difference between Dick Durbin saying this first, and let's say Bernie Sanders saying this first, Dick Durbin opens up a lot more space for people to come in and also say they want a ceasefire. Here is Chris Murphy on Chris Hayes's program last night, ostensibly to talk about Tommy Tuberville, but really, I think, to get this a ceasefire call out there.
Today, you released a statement in which you said the following: the current rate of civilian death inside Gaza is unacceptable and unsustainable. I urge Israel to immediately reconsider its approach and shift to a more deliberate, proportionate counterterrorism campaign, surgically targeting Hamas and Islamic Jihad leaders and terrorist infrastructure, while more highly prioritizing the safety of civilians in accordance with the law of armed conflict. Why did you issue that statement?
So there's no doubt Israel has the right to defend itself, and there's no doubt that Hamas is responsible for these civilian casualties because they hide themselves, their weapons, their infrastructure inside civilian buildings, mosques, schools, and hospitals. But Israel does have a responsibility to weigh the cost to civilians against the ability to target Hamas leaders. And I think when you are talking about 8,000 Palestinian civilians being killed, 3,000 children, there's no way but to come to the conclusion that the cost to civilians has been too high, and that Israel has to reconsider the way in which it balances its desire to go after and get Hamas and the damage being done to civilians. The moral cost is just too high when 3,000 Palestinian children have died, but the strategic cost is too high as well, because as we learned in Afghanistan, when you are too casual or too permissive about civilian casualties, that ends up being recruitment material for the very terrorist groups you are fighting. And so for me, it was important today to say that we have reached a point at which the rate of civilian harm here is too high for Israel to sustain, for the world to sustain, and it's time for them to change course and be much more targeted in their decisions about when they go after terrorists in civilian, heavy civilian population centers.
Now, I mean, it's certainly not hard to sort of take exception to the, sort of the bloodlessness of this. But nevertheless, the point being is that this is the beginning of, at the very least, the pressure that's going to come from the United States, and it's going to build. Blinken is in Israel again with sort of like the obligatory, we stand behind Israel, et cetera, but it is he is there looking for his, humanitarian pause or whatever it is that they're calling. The reason why they're afraid of saying the word ceasefire is because they want the option of going back in, but this is not sustainable.
Yeah.
And I think from a moral standpoint, we've already far surpassed like any justification for what's happening. And frankly, I think from a strategic standpoint, the idea that there's not going to be a generation or two of these under 18-year-old kids who grow up to seek revenge for this. I think that's also hard to imagine that that's not going to happen.
The trauma alone, the trauma of seeing this alone, and if you're just thinking and you only care about Israelis, which I don't agree with, obviously, but just from the perspective of just protecting Israel, this is not the way to go.
No, yeah, exactly. That's the strategic failure of this. And I would also add, there's increasingly, there has been talk, and I have no way of analyzing this, but we certainly saw it with the Russian military, that in many respects they weren't sort of up to the task that everyone assumed that they were in terms of Ukraine. There was a video going around of a Hamas fighter putting essentially like some type of explosive device on a tank, on an Israeli tank, and then running back to the position and firing a shoulder fired anti-tank RPG. And that is an odd thing to be able to be happening. It suggests that maybe there isn't sort of like infantry around providing support for these tanks. I don't know.
That's what Mike Preisner said.
I'm certainly not some type of military. I don't know much, beyond a couple of things I've read, but it is quite possible, and it really hasn't been anything that anyone has talked about, as far as I can see, that the IDF of 2023 is not the IDF of 1985 or 1975. You bring back 300,000 reservists. These are people who, they've been working in tech businesses. They've been working. This is not the same sort of like a type of military. Plus, the other thing is that when you have a military, and I believe this came up maybe some time ago, and I'm not exactly sure in what context, but I'm talking like 5 or 6 years ago. When you have a military whose primary function has been to basically go around and protect settlers who are taking shots at people, and to go and dispossess people of their homes, when you're going up against civilians, they lose their sort of like training edge, as it were, and begin to sort of like get too comfortable in a dynamic where, we were just talking about that clip of Gavin Newsom playing basketball with some kids. Like if you do that all the time, your game doesn't get as strong. And the
IDF forces that are kind of in active duty roles, or were before October 7th, a lot of it was patrolling and working inside of Gaza as like an occupying force.
In West Bank.
In the West Bank as an occupying force versus the active combat that you described.
Exactly.
And the questions about the military failures go back to the 7th, where, the border was unsecure and they were helping settlers in the West Bank.
They're doing exactly what you said, yeah.
Right. So, that is instead of what could have prevented the attack. But just really quickly, because you mentioned Blinken, this is a market shift in tone. I want to read this quote really quickly. I've seen images of Palestinian children, young boys and girls, pulled from the wreckage of buildings. When I see that, when I look into their eyes through the TV screen, I see my own children. I mean, that is not, look, again, we need a ceasefire, but this past 3 or so days, as you say, Sam, it's the first time we've seen some tapping of the brakes from the United States' perspective. And what Blinken is saying there is a 180-degree difference from what he had been saying last week. So the pressure is getting to people. I mean, it's getting to them, thankfully. Obviously, it's becoming untenable. The Israeli propaganda effort isn't working when you see these children, or a father saying, I lost all my 3 children, wailing, where you see, kids saying, did I die? Am I going to my graveyard? And people pulling them out of rubble saying, no, you're okay. And you just see the dust and hear of people talking about the smelling of carcasses. And there's 97% of the water is brackish and not clean. And they can't even get rid of the dust in their eyes and mouths because they don't have water to drink. Surgeries being done without anesthesia. This is the reality, right? And so this is like the first time I feel like in weeks that we've had any movement here, to your point.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see, though. But, and,
I mean, Netanyahu after this said, I reject calls for a ceasefire. So
Blinken should have just put the tweet back up that he tweeted like 3 days after the thing, which is like, I've been talking to Turkey and we're like, hey, we should do a ceasefire and negotiate for hostages. And like, yeah.
The hostages need to be protected as well. I mean, they are in Gaza, presumably.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
We'll see. But again, it is very helpful to have this pressure on these senators are not just being moved by pictures of Palestinians getting killed. They're getting moved because they're seeing a shift in the where the public is on this.
And thanks particularly to Rashida Tlaib.
Yes, her bravery, and Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, and all of the Arab groups backing this. There is a major march happening tomorrow in DC. People can look that up. If you are in the DC area and you want to support the Palestinian cause and protecting these civilians, these historic demonstrations are also having this effect of ramping up the pressure.
Without a doubt. 2 p.m. on the Freedom Plaza.
Yeah.
And, these marches are important. It's important to get out there. People getting arrested in, Grand Central Station, and all of this is having an impact. So hope springs eternal, but it's really been just so devastating to watch the just enormous amount of pain that's been going on. Mm-hmm. It's just, the images have just been horrible.
Suffering by our tax dollar.